The sound that rips you from a deep sleep at 8:02 a.m. isn't just noise. It's a statement. In my case, the statement was being made by a DeWalt wet tile saw screaming its way through a slab of porcelain, and it was saying, "Your master bathroom will one day be beautiful, but for now, your life is a hellscape of fine, inescapable dust." I shuffled onto my porch, clutching a mug of coffee like it was the last life raft on the Titanic. The air, thick with late summer humidity, was already hazy with what my contractor, Dave, cheerfully called progress. I called it a gluten-free snowstorm. It coated the railings, the sad-looking ferns I was trying not to kill, and the inside of my nostrils. This renovation was my personal Everest. A dusty, deafeningly loud Everest, located in the middle of a suburban subdivision that sometimes felt more like a minimum security prison. And the warden was on her morning patrol. Her name was Brenda. Even if you've never met a Brenda, you know a Brenda. She was the self-appointed queen of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association, a position she held with the grim determination of a dictator clinging to power. I watched her march down the sidewalk, clipboard clutched to her chest like a ballistic shield. She had the haircut you see on news reports when a woman is demanding a full refund because her coupon expired yesterday. Short, asymmetrical, and helmet-like in its structural integrity. A-line haircut, A-type personality. A permanent visor was strapped to her forehead, shielding her beady eyes from a sun she likely found to be in violation of some celestial code of conduct. Brenda didn't walk. She advanced. Her orthopedic sneakers slapped the pavement with a rhythm that said, "I am on official business, and that business is making your life slightly more miserable than it was 5 seconds ago." Her target this morning was Dave. He was a mountain of a man, perpetually covered in a layer of sawdust and drywall compound, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite by a disgruntled sculptor. He was currently hunched over the tile saw, a picture of focused labor. He didn't stand a chance. Brenda stopped at the edge of my driveway, a safe distance from the dust cloud, and tapped her foot. It was the kind of tap that could curdle milk. Dave, bless his oblivious heart, didn't notice. The saw screamed on. Brenda cleared her throat, a sound like a cat trying to cough up a ball of steel wool. Nothing. Finally, she took a breath and yelled over the din. "Excuse me!" Dave killed the saw. The sudden silence was more jarring than the noise. He lifted his safety glasses and protective earmuffs, blinking at her like a bear woken from hibernation. "Yeah?" he grunted. "It is 8:02, Brenda announced, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on an imaginary watch on her wrist. Dave stared at her. I took a long sip of my coffee, savoring the impending absurdity. "Okay," Dave said, his tone utterly flat. "HOA Bylaws, Section 4, Subsection C, Paragraph 2, she recited from memory, her voice gaining the righteous fervor of a street preacher. "All contractor work, including the operation of heavy machinery, is permitted to commence no earlier than 8 a.m. and no later than 5 p.m. "So, I'm 2 minutes late," Dave said, his face a perfect mask of confusion. "You are 2 minutes into the approved time frame," she corrected him, as if explaining a complex physics equation to a toddler. "But this is the third time this month your team has begun work after the designated start time. It shows a pattern of disregard for the community's schedule." I almost choked on my coffee. She was complaining that he wasn't starting the noise early enough. This was a new level of insanity, even for her. Dave just slowly put his earmuffs back on. "Got it. Start the noise at 8 on the dot, loud and clear." He fired up the saw again, and Brenda, satisfied that she had defended the temporal sanctity of the neighborhood, nodded sharply and continued her march. That's when I saw Mr. Henderson. He was in his yard across the cul-de-sac, tending to his roses. He was a man in his late 70s, with kind eyes and hands that were gnarled from a lifetime of carpentry and gardening. He'd lived in that house for 40 years, long before the beige tyranny of the HOA had descended. He was also profoundly deaf, a result of a factory accident decades ago. Our communication consisted of friendly waves, the occasional thumbs up, and, if the topic was complex, scribbled notes passed over his fence. He was, without a doubt, the kindest, most harmless soul in the entire subdivision. He was everything Brenda was not. He spotted me on the porch and gave me his usual warm, crinkly-eyed smile and a wave. I waved back, my anger at Brenda softening for a moment. He was the neighborhood's anchor to a time when people just lived their lives without someone measuring their lawn with a ruler. But as I watched him, I saw Brenda stop at the end of our street. She wasn't looking at a manicured lawn or a rogue garbage can. She was staring at the open entrance to our little cul-de-sac, and her expression was one I'd only ever seen on cartoon villains. It was a look of pure, unadulterated ambition. It was the glint in a Bond villain's eye right before they revealed their plan for world domination. I had a sinking feeling I knew what she was planning, thanks to a glossy, tri-fold newsletter I'd recently used as a coaster. It had a headline in a bubbly font: "Get ready for Oak Haven's grand security upgrade." Brenda's grand upgrade. I knew, with the certainty of a man who knows his bathroom won't be finished on time, that this was going to be a disaster. A week later, the disaster arrived on a flatbed truck. It was a gate. Not a simple, functional gate, but a monstrous, wrought-iron behemoth that looked like it had been stolen from the set of a low-budget vampire movie. It was black, covered in pointless, aggressive-looking spikes and gaudy, faux gold fleur-de-lis. It was the kind of gate that screamed, "We have nothing of value, but we are extremely paranoid about it." I half expected a gargoyle to be perched on top, judging my choice of sweatpants. The installation took 2 days, a symphony of beeping trucks and clanging metal that made Dave's tile saw sound like a lullaby. The result was a hideous metal barrier sealing off our 6-house cul-de-sac from the rest of the world. Fortress Oak Haven was now secure. The rollout of the new system was a masterclass in bureaucratic incompetence. Every household received a single, flimsy plastic remote. It had one button and the operational range of a TV remote from 1988. You had to be practically touching the gate with your car bumper for it to work. For guests, there was a keypad mounted on a thick concrete pillar. The code, which Brenda personally emailed to all of us, was 14 digits long. 14. It was like the launch code for a nuclear submarine, only less intuitive. The email itself was a work of art. 5 pages, single-spaced, Times New Roman, 12-point font. It was titled Gate Protocol and Community Security Enhancement Procedures. I read the whole thing, morbidly fascinated. There were sections on approved guest pre-authorization, delivery vehicle provisional access, and my personal favorite, emergency services standard operating procedure, which basically said that in an emergency, first responders were supposed to call a special number that would route them to Brenda's personal cell phone. I was pretty sure that was not only insane, but also wildly illegal. The first few days were pure, unadulterated chaos. I sat on my porch, which had become my personal command center for monitoring the neighborhood's slow-motion collapse, and watched the show. An Amazon driver, faced with the keypad, simply gave up and started chucking packages over the top of the gate like he was competing in a new Olympic sport. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, forgot her remote and laid on her horn for 10 solid minutes, the sound echoing through the cul-de-sac until her husband came trotting out to let her in, waving the remote in the air like he was surrendering. Through it all, Brenda was a constant presence. She would materialize from her house, clipboard in hand, to educate the confused. She'd stand there, smug and patient, explaining her labyrinthine system to flustered pizza delivery guys and exasperated residents. She was in her element, the sole gatekeeper of knowledge in a kingdom of her own creation. But my amusement curdled when I saw how it affected Mr. Henderson. I watched him one afternoon as he tried to leave. He got out of his pristine, mint-green Buick and stood at the keypad, painstakingly punching in the numbers. He finished, paused, and waited. Nothing happened. Because he couldn't hear the confirmation beep or the error buzz, he had no idea if he'd entered it correctly. He tried again, and again. On the fourth try, the gate finally groaned open. The look on his face wasn't just frustration, it was a deep, weary anxiety. This gate, this monument to Brenda's paranoia, wasn't just an inconvenience for him. It was a real, tangible barrier, another way the world was making his life just a little bit harder. And Brenda, in her quest for beige-colored order, was completely blind to it. The day it all went wrong was a sweltering Tuesday. The air was so thick you could chew it. Dave and I were in what was once my living room, now a cavern of exposed studs and wires, having a spirited debate about the optimal placement of a light switch. He was arguing for practicality. I was arguing for a vague, unhelpful concept I called the flow. The flow, Alex, is not gonna matter when you're stumbling around in the dark trying to find the switch behind the door, he said, tapping a blueprint with a pencil the size of a small carrot. But aesthetics, Dave, I countered. You walk in, you see a clean wall. That's when I heard it. A car horn. Not a friendly little beep-beep to say hello. This was a long, sustained, desperate bleh. It cut through the afternoon haze with the urgency of a fire alarm. Dave and I exchanged a look. That wasn't a "my remote isn't working" honk. That was a "something is seriously wrong" honk. I walked to the new bay window, the one Dave said was structurally unnecessary, but I insisted was crucial for natural light, and looked down the street. My stomach tightened. It was Mr. Henderson's mint-green Buick. It was stopped right in front of the gate, but the horn was still blaring, which meant someone else was in the driver's seat. Mr. Henderson himself was standing outside the car, on the street side of the gate, looking frail and panicked in the oppressive heat. He was gesturing wildly at the gate, then at his car. On the other side, inside the cul-de-sac, was a young woman I recognized as his weekly caregiver. She looked frantic, her phone pressed to her ear, her other hand on the gate as if she could physically will it open. Then, like a shark smelling blood in the water, Brenda appeared. She stormed out of her house, her visor pulled down low. My first thought, naively, was, "Oh good, she'll sort this out. I was an idiot." Brenda didn't go to the gate's control panel. She marched right up to the caregiver and started yelling, her entire body vibrating with indignation. I couldn't hear the words from my window, but I could read the body language. The pointing finger, the aggressive stance. She wasn't helping. She was scolding. She was lecturing the poor woman about blocking the entrance, about protocol, about the rules. She didn't even glance at Mr. Henderson, who was now leaning against his car, looking pale and unsteady. The pieces clicked into place in my head with a sickening thud. The caregiver must have arrived to find the gate closed. She drove Mr. Henderson's car out to meet him at the entrance, probably to help him with groceries. But his remote must have died or been forgotten. He couldn't work the keypad. The caregiver's remote was inside the gate with her. They were separated by a few feet of iron and a mountain of stupidity. And Mr. Henderson, who couldn't hear his own car horn or Brenda's screeching, was literally trapped outside his own home in 100-degree heat. Brenda didn't see a person in distress. She saw an infraction, a disruption to her perfect, orderly system. A hot, white-hot rage I hadn't felt in years flooded my chest. It was so pure, so potent, it almost made me dizzy. The debate about the light switch, the dust, the endless renovation stress, it all vanished. All that was left was a crystal-clear sense of purpose. "That's it," I said, my voice low. "The gloves are off." Dave looked at me. "What are you gonna do?" "I'm going to fix this," I said. I walked out of the living room, past the stacks of drywall and boxes of tile, and went straight to the kitchen. There was a drawer next to the fridge, my junk drawer. It was a sacred place, an organized chaos of old keys from previous apartments, spare screws, miscellaneous electronic dongles, and the tools of my former trade. Before I started consulting from home, I was a fire safety and commercial building inspector. I reached into the back of the drawer, my fingers closing around a small, unassuming key with a bright red plastic top. It was a Knox key, a fire key. It's a universal master key that allows fire departments and other emergency services to access commercial buildings, apartment complexes, and gated communities. It opens everything from gate control boxes to elevator service panels. It is a key of absolute authority, designed to bypass all the petty rules and locks when lives are on the line. And Brenda's little tin pot dictatorship was about to get a lesson in what a real emergency looked like. I pocketed the key and walked out my front door, my steps cool and deliberate. The 2-minute countdown had begun. I walked down my driveway with a strange sense of calm. The world seemed to slow down. The sun beat on my shoulders, the buzz of a distant lawnmower hung in the air, and Brenda's voice grew louder, a shrill, angry hornet's nest of sound. Absolutely irresponsible. This is a single point of entry. You are creating a safety hazard by blocking it. She was screeching at the caregiver, who looked like she was about to burst into tears. I didn't break stride. I walked right past them as if they were statues in a park. I didn't make eye contact. I didn't say a word. I could feel Brenda's tirade falter as her eyes tracked me, her brain trying to process this new, unexpected variable. I ignored her. My focus was the gray metal control box mounted next to the keypad. It had a small, circular lock near the top, discreet and unassuming. The Knox lock. I pulled the red key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a satisfying, perfect click. I gave it a quarter turn. There was a loud thunk from inside the box as the magnetic lock disengaged. A second later, with a low electronic hum, the massive iron gate began to swing smoothly and silently inward. The whole operation, from the moment I left my porch to the moment the gate was fully open, took maybe 90 seconds. The caregiver let out a gasp of relief and immediately ran to Mr. Henderson, who looked exhausted but profoundly grateful. The car horn finally fell silent. The silence was then shattered by a sound of pure, distilled fury. "What do you think you're doing?" I turned slowly to face Brenda. Her face was a fascinating palette of reds, starting at a pale pink of confusion and rapidly darkening to a deep crimson of rage. Her mouth was a thin, white line. Her hands were clenched into tiny, furious fists at her sides. "I was opening the gate," I said, my voice calm and even. I pulled the key from the lock and held it up between my thumb and forefinger. "You know, its primary function. You seem to be having a bit of trouble with it. That is HOA property," she shrieked, taking a step toward me. "You have illegally tampered with it. You have no authority to touch that box." "Actually," I said, leaning against the now open gate, "I think I do. I am the president of this association. I am calling the police. This is destruction of property, vandalism." Each accusation was punctuated by a sharp, stabbing point of her finger in my direction. I let her finish, letting the silence hang for a moment before I delivered the kill shot. I held up the key again, so the sun glinted off the red plastic. "This," I began, my voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher, "is a fire department access key, Brenda. It's often called a Knox key. It's required by City Ordinance 34. B, you can look it up, for emergency vehicle access on any new gated enclosure. This gate, being a new installation, is legally required to have this manual override. Since there was an elderly resident in medical distress due to the heat, trapped by a malfunctioning gate, I deemed it an emergency. I was simply utilizing a city-mandated safety feature to resolve the situation." I gave her a small, tight smile. "I'm also happy to report that the system works perfectly. You should be pleased. Our community is up to code." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, making little fish-like motions. The barrage of official-sounding words, ordinance, city-mandated, safety feature, up to code, was like a foreign language to her. It was a higher authority than her precious HOA, and she had no idea how to combat it. Her brain visibly short-circuited. Mr. Henderson, with the help of his caregiver, had gotten back into his Buick. As she drove slowly past me, he leaned out the passenger window and gave me a long, heartfelt look of thanks, his hand over his heart. I just gave him a simple nod. The caregiver mouthed, "Thank you so much," as they drove through. Brenda finally found her voice again, though it was now a low, menacing hiss. "You haven't heard the last of this," she whispered. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "I have you on camera. I have witnesses." "Great," I said cheerfully. "Send me a copy. I think I looked pretty good." She let out a frustrated scream, a sound like a tea kettle reaching its boiling point, whipped out her phone and took a blurry, rage-fueled picture of me standing there. Then she spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, the slap of her orthopedic shoes on the pavement a drumbeat of promised retribution. The war was on. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout, but it didn't come from Brenda. Not at first. About an hour later, my doorbell rang. It was my next-door neighbor, a quiet woman named Carol, holding a plate of still warm chocolate chip cookies. "I saw what you did," she whispered, glancing around nervously as if Brenda had snipers positioned on the rooftops. "That was amazing. Thank you." "Just helping a neighbor," I said, accepting the plate. "No," she insisted, her voice low. "You stood up to her. Nobody does that." Over the next few hours, it became clear that my little act of civil disobedience had been the talk of the cul-de-sac. Another neighbor, a guy I only knew from waving at when he got his mail, slipped a note into my mailbox. It was written on a Post-it note and simply said, "You're my hero." Someone else left a six-pack of a decent IPA on my porch with no note at all. It seemed I had accidentally become the leader of the Oak Haven suburban resistance. It was a role I wasn't sure I wanted, but the cookies were a definite perk. When Dave came back from his lunch break, he found me on the porch eating a cookie and contemplating my newfound status as a local legend. "Saw the show," he said, grabbing a water bottle from his cooler. "You got guts, kid, or you're an idiot. Haven't decided which yet." "Why not both?" I said through a mouthful of chocolate chips. "You poked the bear," he said, taking a long drink. "It was a really, really annoying bear, Dave. A bear with a clipboard and a superiority complex." "Yeah, well, now it's an angry bear with a lawyer and too much time on its hands," he warned. "I've worked in neighborhoods like this before. Women like that, they don't just get mad. They get even. They use the rules like a weapon. Check your permit box every morning. She'll be looking for any little thing to shut you down. Any excuse." Dave's prophecy came true faster than I could have imagined. The next morning, taped to my front door with an aggressive amount of Scotch tape, was a crisp, official-looking letter from the Oak Haven Estates HOA. Official notice of violation. It was addressed to me in a passive-aggressive, computer-generated font. "Dear resident, this letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the Oak Haven Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions. CC, and ours. An inspection on this date has found the following infraction at your property. Violation Section 7, Subsection F, Architectural and Landscape Standards. Description: unapproved construction debris and commercial vehicles visible from the street during non-operational hours. A white contractor's pickup truck was parked in the driveway at 7:15 a.m. Corrective action required. All commercial vehicles and debris must be removed or stored out of sight by the end of each workday. Fine assessed, $100. Failure to remit payment and correct the violation within 10 business days will result in further fines and potential liens placed upon your property. Sincerely, the Oak Haven Estates Architectural Review Committee. I knew for a fact that the Architectural Review Committee was just Brenda, probably sitting at her kitchen table in a silk robe, cackling as she printed it. Dave's truck. She was coming after my renovation. She couldn't get me for the gate, so she was going to bleed me dry with 1,000 tiny bureaucratic paper cuts. I looked at the notice, then at Dave's truck, which was parked neatly in my driveway. I crumpled the letter in my fist. Oh, it was on. It was so on. That night, I declared war. My weapon wasn't a fire key or a sharp tongue. It was a 3-ring binder, thick and heavy enough to be used as a blunt instrument. It contained the Oak Haven Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions. 200 pages of the most soul-crushingly boring prose ever assembled by mankind. I had received it in a welcome packet when I bought the house and had promptly used it to level a wobbly table. Now, it was my sacred text. I brewed a pot of coffee so strong it could dissolve steel, sat down at my dusty makeshift dining table, and began to read. I was a man possessed. I was Liam Neeson, and my daughter was a specific clause hidden somewhere in the depths of this bureaucratic nightmare. I would find it. For hours, I waded through dense legalese about approved fence heights, the correct shade of beige for exterior paint — there were 3, all indistinguishable to the human eye — and rules about the placement of garden gnomes, strictly forbidden. It was a document written by sadists for sadists. But then, around my 3rd cup of coffee, I started finding things. Little cracks in Brenda's fortress. First, I found the section on contractor work she'd cited against me. I read it, then read it again. It did say vehicles had to be stored out of sight. However, I found a subclause in a different section, under parking regulations, that specifically stated, temporary parking of commercial vehicles for the purpose of active home improvement or repair is permissible, provided it does not obstruct traffic. Dave's truck was in my driveway. It wasn't obstructing anything. My $100 fine was bogus. Bingo. Energized by this small victory, I kept digging. I flipped to the section on capital improvements and community alterations. It stated that any expenditure over $5,000 or any alteration that materially affects all residents required a formal vote at a general meeting, with a quorum of at least 50% of homeowners present. I did some quick searching online. A commercial security gate, like the one they installed, costs, on the low end, between $10,000 and $15,000. I knew for a fact there had been no general meeting. Brenda had pushed it through via an email poll, which I now suspected didn't meet the legal requirements of the bylaws. Strike 2. Then, I went for the kill. I put the HOA binder aside and went online, diving into my old stomping grounds, municipal and state building codes. This was my home turf. It took me less than 30 minutes to find what I was looking for. I found the city fire code concerning automated gates. It explicitly stated that the entrance must have a minimum clear width of 20 feet to accommodate a fire engine's turning radius. I went outside with a tape measure. Brenda's gate provided a clear width of exactly 16 feet. Strike 3. I also found a regulation stating that any primary access gate for a residential community of more than 4 homes must be equipped with a fail-safe battery backup system in case of a power outage. Our gate was wired directly to the grid. A power outage would trap everyone inside, or outside. You're out. I printed everything. The relevant pages from the bylaws, the city ordinances, the fire codes. I got a highlighter and marked the key passages with vicious glee. I was no longer just a guy renovating his bathroom. I was a legal scholar, a suburban warrior armed with a laser printer and a righteous sense of indignation. Brenda wanted a war of paperwork? Fine. I was about to bury her in it. The next morning, I launched my counteroffensive. I drafted a formal appeal to the Architectural Review Committee. It was a thing of beauty, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate speak. "Dear Committee," I began, "I am writing to formally appeal the fine assessed on date regarding violation 7F, as per Section 9, subsection B of the CC and Rs, temporary parking of commercial vehicles for the purpose of active home improvement is permissible. As the vehicle in question was parked in my private driveway for this express purpose, the violation is invalid. Therefore, I respectfully request that the fine be rescinded immediately." But I didn't stop there. I went on the attack. "Furthermore," I continued, "I wish to file a formal complaint against HOA President Brenda Miller for a pattern of harassment, as defined under Section 12, nuisance. Her repeated, targeted, and baseless accusations create a hostile environment for residents. This complaint is supported by multiple homeowners who are willing to provide statements. I bluffed on that last part, but I was pretty sure I could get them if needed. I hand-delivered it to Brenda's mailbox, imagining her face as she read it. It was a small, satisfying thought. Her response was swift and predictable. She doubled down. The violation notices started appearing on my door like clockwork. One day, it was for my lawn. "Grass height exceeds the maximum allowable 3 inches by approximately 1/4 inch. I got a ruler." She was right. The fine was $50. The next day, it was for improper storage of construction materials, because Dave had left a single empty paint can near my garage. Another $50. Then came the noise complaint, claiming the decibel level of power tools was excessive, even during approved hours. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, just as Dave had predicted. She was trying to annoy me into submission. She didn't know me very well. This just made me dig in my heels harder. The climax of our little Cold War came on a Friday afternoon. My phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered, putting it on speaker for Dave, who was busy installing a cabinet to hear. "Hello? Is this Alex from 412 Oak Haven Court?" The voice was clipped, cold, and instantly recognizable. "It is," I said, leaning back in my chair. "To whom do I have the pleasure of speaking?" "This is Brenda Miller, president of the Homeowners Association," she announced, as if I didn't know. "Brenda, what a surprise! How can I help you?" "I am calling to inform you," she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction, "that I have been in contact with the City Permits Department. They have a number of questions about your renovation, about your adherence to setback requirements and your debris disposal plan. It seems your permits may be reevaluated." This was a serious escalation. Messing with my permits could shut down the whole project for weeks, costing me thousands. "Is that so?" I said, keeping my voice level. "And did you mention to them that the HOA's new front gate is in direct violation of at least 2 city fire codes, including emergency vehicle access width? Because I feel like the permits department might be very interested in an unpermitted structure that actively endangers the residents. That feels like a bigger priority than my setback, which, for the record, is perfectly to code." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Dave froze. A cabinet door held halfway in the air, a slow grin spreading across his face. You wouldn't," Brenda stammered. Brenda, let me be very clear, I said, my voice dropping the friendly pretense. You stop harassing me, my contractor, and my neighbors. You stop inventing bogus fines. You stop this pathetic little power trip. You leave us alone. And in return, I won't feel obligated, as a concerned citizen, to forward my file on the gate's numerous safety and legal violations to the fire marshal and the city planning commission. It's your call. She was quiet for a long moment. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head, weighing her hatred for me against the potential for a catastrophic, public, and expensive defeat. This isn't over, she finally hissed, and hung up. I looked at Dave. He slowly screwed the cabinet door into its hinge. I think, he said, that you might be more of an idiot than I thought. But I also think you might just win. I honestly thought my last phone call with Brenda might have scared her into a tactical retreat. A week went by with no new violation notices. A fragile peace settled over the cul-de-sac. I started to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had decided I was more trouble than I was worth. Then came the police. I was outside with Dave, the two of us standing over a set of blueprints spread across the hood of his truck. We were deep in a critical discussion about gutter downspout placement when a black and white cruiser rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac and parked at the curb in front of my house. Well, hell, Dave muttered under his breath. Two officers got out. One was older, probably in his 50s, with a weary face that suggested he'd seen every form of human stupidity imaginable and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of them. This was Officer Miller. The other was young, with a stiff posture and a jawline so sharp it could cut glass. He looked like he had memorized the entire penal code for fun. This was Officer Evans. Before they could even take 2 steps, Brenda materialized, power-walking from her house with an urgency usually reserved for Black Friday sales. She got to them first, launching into her story with the breathless drama of a seasoned actress. "Officers, thank God you're here," she began, one hand on her chest. "That man," she pointed at me, "has been a menace to this community. He has willfully and illegally tampered with our security gate. He bypassed a $1 million security device. We have him on video. I am genuinely concerned for the safety of our residents." Miller's face remained a perfect, unreadable mask of professional boredom. Evans, however, was taking it all in, his expression serious, his hand resting near his sidearm. They walked over to us. I stayed put, leaning casually against Dave's truck, my arms crossed. Panic is a confession. Calm is a statement. "Good afternoon, officers," I said politely. "Sir, we've received a complaint about destruction of property and tampering with a security installation," Evans said, his voice all official business. "This woman claims you forced open that gate." "Forced is a strong word," I replied. "Opened is more accurate." "And did you have authorization to do so?" Evans pressed. Before I could answer, Miller, the older cop, spoke up, his voice a low, tired drawl. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, "what exactly happened?" Brenda recounted her version of the incident, painting me as a rogue agent of chaos who, for no reason, decided to attack the gate. She conveniently left out the part about Mr. Henderson being trapped in the heat. When she was finished, Miller looked at me. "Your side of the story, sir." I told it simply and factually. I explained that my elderly, deaf neighbor was locked out, showing signs of heat exhaustion, and that the gate was malfunctioning. I explained that his caregiver was on the other side, unable to help him. "So you took matters into your own hands," Evans said, his tone accusatory. "I used a key," I corrected him gently. "I didn't use a crowbar. There was no damage. I used the key designed for that exact purpose in that exact type of situation. An emergency." "A civilian shouldn't have a key like that," Brenda interjected. "Sir, can I see this key?" Miller asked, ignoring her. I nodded, went into my house, and came back with the red Knox key. I handed it to him. Evans peered at it like it was an alien artifact. Miller, however, took it, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his tired eyes. He walked over to the gate's control box, with Evans and a fuming Brenda trailing behind him. He slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. He then turned it back and removed it. He looked at the gate, then at Brenda. "This is a standard fire access key box, ma'am." "It's for emergency personnel only," she insisted. "He is not emergency personnel." Miller turned to me. "What do you do for a living, sir?" "I'm a fire safety consultant," I said. "My old job was as a commercial building inspector for the county. I'm legally authorized to carry a master set for inspection and training purposes." It wasn't a lie, just a slight stretch of my current job description. Miller nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. He'd seen this movie before. He understood. Evans, on the other hand, still looked conflicted. "But sir," Evans said to his partner, "even so, this is private property. He shouldn't have—" Miller held up a hand, cutting him off. He turned his full attention to Brenda. "Ma'am, let me explain something to you. This gentleman did not commit a crime. He used a non-destructive method to render aid to a person in distress. A situation, I might add, that was created by your gate. Trapping an elderly man outside his home in this heat is a liability nightmare. If he'd had a stroke, you and your HOA would be in a world of trouble." He wasn't done. "Furthermore," he continued, gesturing toward the gate, "I'm not a building inspector, but this entrance looks awfully narrow for a ladder truck to make the turn. If there was a fire back here, and our truck couldn't get through because of an illegally installed gate, people could die, and the city's lawyers would have a field day with your HOA." Brenda's face went completely white. She had been so focused on her own petty rules that the idea of real-world life-or-death consequences had never occurred to her. Miller handed the key back to me. "I'd get that gate checked out and brought up to code, ma'am, immediately." He looked at me and gave a subtle nod. "You have a good day, sir." To Evans, he just said, "Let's go." They walked back to their cruiser, leaving Brenda standing on the sidewalk, utterly defeated. Her ultimate weapon, calling the authorities, had not only failed, but it had backfired spectacularly. She had been publicly dressed down by the very power she sought to wield. She shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred, then turned and scurried back to her house, her reign of terror officially on the ropes. Brenda's public humiliation at the hands of Officer Miller was the beginning of her end. The story whipped around the cul-de-sac. Emboldened by her defeat, neighbors started talking to each other. I became the de facto hub of the rebellion. People would stop by while walking their dogs to share their own horror stories about Brenda, fines for holiday decorations left up a day too late, angry letters about the wrong type of mulch. Brenda, in a last-ditch effort to reclaim her authority, made a fatal mistake. She called an emergency HOA meeting. The official reason, stated on the flyer she shoved in everyone's mailbox, was to discuss recent security breaches and unauthorized resident conduct. It was a thinly veiled attempt at a public show trial, with me as the star defendant. She didn't realize I had spent the week preparing for exactly this. I had spoken to nearly every homeowner. I had a polite, note-based conversation with Mr. Henderson and got his full blessing. I had my highlighted binder of bylaws and my printouts of the city codes. I was ready. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled faintly of chlorine and desperation. About 15 of us were there, a huge turnout for an HOA meeting. Brenda stood at a podium at the front, looking severe and important. She began with a 20-minute monologue, a grand speech about the importance of order, security, and property values. She painted a picture of a community under threat from rogue elements, me, who sought to undermine the very fabric of their peaceful existence. She described the incident at the gate as a brazen act of vandalism and called for my formal censure and a hefty fine. When she finished, she looked around the room, expecting applause or at least solemn nods of agreement. Instead, she was met with silence. "Are there any questions?" she asked, a slight tremble in her voice. I stood up. "I don't have a question," I said, holding up my folder. "I have a presentation." A murmur went through the room. Brenda's eyes narrowed. "This is not on the agenda." "I move to add it to the agenda," said Carol, the neighbor who'd brought me cookies. Someone else seconded it. Flustered, Brenda had no choice but to let me speak. I walked to the front of the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use inflammatory language. I just calmly, methodically, and surgically dismantled her entire argument. "Point 1, I began, holding up a copy of the bylaws. "The gate. Per Section 11, any capital improvement over $5,000 requires a general vote with a 50% quorum. This gate was never put to a proper vote. Its installation was, therefore, illegitimate." Whispers started to fill the room. "Point 2, I said, holding up the printout of the fire code. "The gate itself is a safety hazard. It violates City Fire Code 2, 1.1, which requires a 20-foot clearance. This gate is 16 feet wide. It also violates Code 3, 4.2, which mandates a battery backup, which this gate does not have. In a fire or power outage, this gate becomes a trap." The whispers grew louder. People were looking at Brenda, whose face was pale. "Point 3, I continued, is the human cost." I nodded toward the back of the room. "Mr. Henderson's caregiver, Maria, would like to say a few words." Maria, the young woman from that day, stood up. Her voice was quiet but steady as she described the panic she felt, watching her elderly, vulnerable patient trapped in the baking sun, all while the HOA president yelled at her for breaking protocol instead of helping. It was a powerful, emotional testimony that sucked all the air out of the room. "This gate isn't security," I concluded, my voice firm. "It's a liability. It's illegal. And it was pushed through by a president who has consistently put her own obsession with control over the safety and well-being of the residents she is supposed to serve." I sat down. The silence that followed was heavy. Then my neighbor with the dog spoke up. "I make a motion," he said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence, "to remove Brenda Miller as president of the HOA, effective immediately." "Seconded," Carol yelled. The vote was a landslide. It wasn't even close. Brenda stood there, utterly broken, as her little empire crumbled around her. She didn't say a word. She just gathered her clipboard and walked out of the room, her reign officially over. In the world of suburban politics, news travels at the speed of gossip. By the next morning, everyone knew. Brenda had been dethroned. A quiet but palpable sense of relief settled over the cul-de-sac. It felt like the sun was shining a little brighter. The first official act of the new, hastily formed interim HOA board, led by the surprisingly competent Carol, was to deal with the gate. They couldn't afford to have it ripped out immediately, so they did the next best thing. They had a maintenance guy come out and lock it permanently in the open position, pending a full review. The beast had been defanged. A week later, I was sitting on my nearly finished porch. The last of the tile had been laid, the walls were painted, and the dust had finally settled. Dave was packing up his tools for the last time, the renovation finally complete. I handed him a cold beer from the six-pack someone had left me. "To a job well done," I said, clinking my bottle against his. "And to poking the bear," he said with a grin. "Turns out the bear was just a declawed kitten with a clipboard." We sat there in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the evening settle in. There were no more violation notices on my door. The neighborhood felt lighter, more relaxed. Just then, Mr. Henderson walked over from his yard. He moved with a spryness I hadn't seen in him for a while. He stopped at the edge of my new porch steps and held something out to me. It was a rose, a perfect, deep red rose from his prize-winning garden, its petals velvety and flawless. He couldn't say the words, but he didn't need to. The gratitude in his eyes spoke volumes. I took the rose, my throat suddenly tight. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," I said, making sure he could see my lips form the words. "It's beautiful." He gave me that warm, crinkly-eyed smile, nodded once, and then headed back to his garden. I put the rose down gently on the railing and took a long sip of my beer. I looked at my house, at the peaceful, gate-free street, at the neighbors walking by and giving me friendly waves. It was all quiet. Finally. "You know, Dave," I said, a mischievous idea taking root, "I'm thinking of painting the front door." "Yeah? What color?" I took another drink, a slow grin spreading across my face. "Something bright," I said. "Something totally, completely, and utterly not HOA approved.